Let's get started. I'm using artificial aids today at the risk of losing all my academic honors and being stripped of my sponsorships. But I have laryngitis, and I figured this is the best way for me to get through the lecture. Yesterday, I woke up and had no voice at all and had to give a lecture on Hamlet at Boston College. So I opened my mouth, and nothing comes out. Fortunately, at Boston College, they're used to that from their professors. So, terrible joke, shamelessly pandering to my Harvard audience. They have a great political science department over there, and I love them. But anyway, I managed to get a microphone there and survive, so I thought I'd use it here. And it seems to be going fine. Let me know if you can't hear me. Someone asked me to recommend some books on Shakespeare. I'm actually not here to get you to read Shakespeare criticism. I'm here to get you to read Plato and Aristotle and Machiavelli and other political theorists whom I think will really help you in reading Shakespeare. But here are a few. I mentioned Alan Bloom's Shakespeare's Politics last time. That has excellent essays on Merchant of Venice, Othello, and Julius Caesar. So it really does apply to this course very well. And I should say that book came out in 1965, and it really was in many ways the beginning of the way I approach Shakespeare. I learned a lot from that book. Leslie Fiedler's The Stranger in Shakespeare has wonderful essays on Merchant of Venice and Othello. And that, to my knowledge, is the first book to argue about the homosexuality of Antonio. That's way back in the 1970s, very pioneering book. And I'm going to talk a bit about theory of comedy today. Two very good books on Shakespeare and comedy are Northrop Frye's A Natural Perspective and C.L. Barber's Shakespeare's Festive Comedy. And again, this is not an assignment and it won't be on the final, but some of you have been asking me to recommend some books, so there they are. Okay, I want to begin with some general words about comedy. Merchant of Venice is the only comedy we're doing, and notice it barely is a comedy. It's no accident that in a course on Shakespeare's politics, we're not concentrating on comedy, because Shakespearean comedy tends to abstract from politics. Very often, Shakespeare's comedies take place in a kind of never-never land, in a utopia. In order to get a comic ending, Shakespeare often has to eliminate the political elements. This is one indication that politics is a fundamentally tragic activity for Shakespeare. Indeed, politics is where people die for their principles. It's where they fight to the death for their way of life. Therefore, politics rarely has comic outcomes. Merchant of Venice is unusual among Shakespeare's comedies that it's set in a real city, in Venice, and where the realities of Venetian politics come into play. And as I'll show today, Shakespeare really has to force things in order to bring out a comic outcome. So again, that's why we're not doing much comedy in this course, but I wanted to include one, and Merchant of Venice is the most appropriate one. And I did want to schematize what I was talking about last time with my personal comedy tragedy matrix here. And I think it's an interesting way of conceptualizing the relation of comedy and tragedy. As we've been seeing, in comedy, the great virtue is flexibility or adaptability. It's going with the flow. It's not letting principles stand in the way of your happiness. It's not letting the law or tradition stand in the way of your happiness. Comic figures are those who do what they have to be happy. And if it means, as Portia does, twisting the love test so that the outcome is what she wants, that's fine. So maybe she'll cheat a bit with the song. By the same token, the great vice for comedy is obstinacy. It is sticking to your principles. It's not going with the flow. It's not bending. It's being inflexible. I've read this before, but it's worth looking at again on page 6, so Act 1, Scene 1. What Gratiano says of Antonio and this is about line 85, Act 1, Scene 1, and creep into the jaundice by being peevish. In a way, yeah, to comic figures, tragic figures look merely peevish. I tell you what, Antonio, I love thee, and 'tis my love that speaks. There are a sort of men whose visages do cream and mantle like a standing pond, and do a wilful stillness entertain, with purpose to be dressed in opinion of wisdom, gravity, profound conceit, as who should say, I am Sir Oracle, and when I ope my lips let no dog bark. O my Antonio, I do know of these that therefore only are reputed wise for saying nothing. Now, this is the truth of comedy. Comedy shows us that there are people in the world who are merely reputed wise, who are merely reputed virtuous, who are merely reputed great. This is what comedy contributes to our understanding of the world. It shows us people who are phonies, who are hypocrites, who have an overinflated opinion of themselves, who think they're principled, but they're really not. It makes fun of them. It gets them out of the way. They stand in the way of our happiness. Now, in tragedy is the flip-flop of this. In tragedy, the great virtue is integrity. It's standing up for your principles. It's, in fact, being willing to die for your principles. And what the tragic hero objects to is pliancy. People who don't have any principles, who run away from a battle to survive because they won't stand up for what they believe in. So you can see what tragedy calls integrity, comedy calls obstinacy. And what comedy calls flexibility, tragedy calls pliancy. These really are two very distinct views of life. And that's why it's quite amazing that Shakespeare is able to be proficient in either comedy or tragedy. What goes along with this is the typical outcome of comedy or tragedy. That is, comedy is inclusive and tragedy is exclusive. I'll start with tragedy first. Tragedy works by having to exclude the tragic figures from the outcome of the play. They are in some ways too large for the world they live in. They represent principles and an absoluteness that the ordinary community will not tolerate. So that by the end of the play, a tragedy deals with the disruption of a community. It reforms, but only at the expense of its greatest members. I mean, Coriolanus would be an example. Coriolanus is the greatest Roman if valor is held to be the chiefest virtue. He's in a way too Roman even for Rome. He represents Rome at the peak of Romanness, and it turns out that Rome is a little more compromising than Coriolanus. And Rome understands you can't form a community of Coriolanuses who are so absolute. And so he, in effect, dies so that a lesser community can be reformed in his absence. It's actually very interesting of all three Roman plays, and also characteristic of Shakespearean tragedy in general, that the most interesting and impressive characters are all dead by the end of the play. That's what we call it, a tragedy. But the Rome of Coriolanus has to get rid of Coriolanus. By the end of Julius Caesar's dead, Cassius is dead, Brutus is dead. We got Antony saying, the noblest Roman of them all is dead. And people are talking about how the son of Rome is set. We've got a community, but it's of diminished people. Similarly, at the end of Antony and Cleopatra, the hero and the heroine, the most impressive people in the play, they're dead. It's actually a very interesting pattern if you look at the way each of those three plays ends. It ends with the man most benefiting from the death of the heroes praising them. Ophidius seems to praise Coriolanus. Mark Antony seems to praise Brutus. Octavius seems to praise Antony and Cleopatra. It's a very interesting pattern where the people who survive are more manipulative, more adaptable. They're the survivors, and they pay tribute almost a kind of tragic tribute to the people who've died, but with the realer sense, we're better rid of them, and now I'm in charge. You get a real sense of diminishment at the end of Shakespearean tragedy. The end of King Lear is a perfect example where either Edgar or Kent, depending upon which text, says, the eldest have borne most. We that are young shall never live so long nor see so much. There's a sense, King Lear represents a kind of titan that this lesser world will never experience. So in a way, that is what is tragic about the tragic ending of a Shakespearean tragedy. That the greatest heroes have proven in their integrity too much for their world. They've lived by an absolute principle that ordinary people can't live up to. Now, by comparison, comedy I call inclusive because it works very hard to bring everybody together at the end. The notion is the community is refounded, but it makes every effort to include everybody, which is why the famous formula that comedy ends with marriages and tragedy with death. Death is an image of exclusion. Marriage is an image of inclusion. It's bringing two people together, and Shakespeare loves multiple marriages at the end of his comedies. I think there's 4 at the end of As You Like It. Comedy, marriage means festivity. People get together and party at the end of a comedy. And the flexibility is necessary for the inclusiveness, just as the integrity produces the exclusiveness. In tragedy, you have people who have too much integrity to survive in a world that looks limited to them. And in a sense, they would rather die than accommodate themselves to that world. And in comedy, the whole point of flexibility is, life over principles. We're going to survive. It's not worth killing over. Tragedy is the whole world of, it's worth killing over. It's worth dying over. Comedy is the world of, it's not worth killing over. And those are 2 fundamental human attitudes. And it's quite remarkable. We have these forms, comedy and tragedy, to explore them. And again, I'll say it's a sign of Shakespeare's remarkable comprehensiveness, both emotionally and intellectually, that he was able to function so well in both worlds of comedy and tragedy. Now, I should say that Shakespearean tragedy tends not to be perfectly inclusive at the end. He very often introduces some kind of discordant note. We're going to see it in Merchant of Venice most prominently, but there often is 1 or 2 characters who won't fit in. At the end of Twelfth Night, Malvolio storms off and says, I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you, as if he was suddenly discovered he's a tragic figure in the middle of the comedy. At the end of As You Like It, there's this character, Jacques, who's a malcontent and satirist, and he runs off. I call this tragic relief. Shakespeare likes a little element at the end of his plays where he reminds us, the world isn't perfect and comedy doesn't always work out. Just wants to give us a little glimpse of a world beyond it. It's so fascinating. There's a song that appears in both Twelfth Night and King Lear. So Shakespeare's reminding us in either world that comedy can easily move to tragedy. Tragedy, we could hope, could be resolved comically. But anyway, I give you this diagram to help conceptualize this. And if you'll think about this, it'll help you understand, I think, the Merchant of Venice specifically. Because you can see here, tragedy is an aristocratic principle. It depends upon the idea that there are great human beings, men and women, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, Brutus, and so on, who have this massive integrity and stand for something remarkable, and will do so to the death, and often do die because their principles, their values are incompatible with the values of their community. This is where Hegel's understanding of tragedy is very helpful, because, I mean, when he presents tragedy as the conflict of two goods, this is what he has in mind. Often it is the good of a heroic individual and the good of the community. Now, what's interesting, though, I mean, Hegel defines tragedy in terms of the situation. What's tragic for Hegel is a certain situation. Aristotle speaks of the tragic hero, and I like to integrate the two theories, Hegel and Aristotle, by speaking of the need for a tragic hero in a tragic situation. So the destiny for Shakespeare is character plus circumstances. That is, Hegel's right. You need a certain tragic situation. You need, for example, a situation where someone feels a conflict between his integrity as a warrior and what the city seems to be demanding of him. But you still need a certain kind of person in that situation. And here, Hegel's favorite example, Antigone, is very helpful. How many of you know Antigone? Good, okay. So again, that's the quintessential Hegelian situation, the good of the city and the good of the family. Antigone disobeys her city because she feels a need to bury her brother who's been rejected from burial as a traitor to the city. But people often forget Antigone has a sister, and her name is Ismene. And if there were just Ismene, there would be no tragedy. She's faced with the exact same situation. Polynices is her brother too, but she has an exchange with Antigone where she says, "We can't do this. Creon has forbidden it. You're crazy. This is too dangerous." And you really see there why you need a certain kind of character in a certain kind of situation to produce tragedy. And again, it is this integrity, this sense that my loyalty to my brother's memory is constitutive of my being. I cannot be Antigone if I don't bury Polynices. Ismene has no problem getting out of that and saying, let somebody else do it. So it's a good way of understanding how tragedy operates. You need a certain kind of hero in a certain kind of situation. Now, to apply this to Merchant of Venice, what I've been saying is that the play is really the story of Portia and how she gets Bassanio. And that depends a great deal on her flexibility. I tried to show you how she plays with the terms of her father's will. She obeys the letter of the law. But if some of us are right, that the song is a clue to Bassanio, or that she's shooting him secret glances, or that we've seen her predisposition to load the test against a suitor she doesn't like, as with the German suitor, then we see that she is flexible to the point of cheating. And again, this would look to a serious moralist or a tragic figure as a lack of integrity. But she has a perfect argument on her side, namely the good, which in her case means happiness. She brings about a good outcome by bending the law. We'll see how she operates in the trial scene in a moment. But what I'm saying is the Merchant of Venice is unusual because of the weight it gives to the obstinate figures in the play. Again, usually the obstinate figures, they're called blocking agents in comic theory, they're usually just old fogies, or think of Scrooge in Dickens' A Christmas Carol. He's pretty nasty, but what it comes down to is he's just a skinflint. He's just a miser, a penny pincher, and it's not so easy to, not so difficult to overcome that. And again, if you haven't read Christmas Carol, you've seen a movie or you know the story. I mean, the the shape of A Christmas Carol is quintessential comedy. You've got this nasty old miser who's making life miserable for everybody, including Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim. But at the end, we have a holiday feast, and everyone's partying, including Scrooge. You see, he's had a reformation. He has had a conversion. He's converted from miserliness to neighborliness. And that doesn't take all that much. It's a little hard to make miserliness into a major principle. But in this play, it's pretty complicated. Both Antonio and Shylock are in a way old fogies. As I've showed you, they're spoiling the fun of the young people. But for example, Shylock is doing it because of his Judaism. And it's a little hard to regard that as something that it's easy to convert from. It's very easy how this word conversion moves from a sort of ordinary context to a religious context. Giving up your miserliness, okay. Giving up your Judaism, that's a little more to take. I think it's one reason why people balk at this play, that the comic resolution demands a conversion at a fundamental level that doesn't go so easy with us, although it might with some people, and perhaps with some of Shakespeare's contemporaries. In the case of Antonio, I've argued he's the only serious Christian in the play. He adopts ultimately a kind of Christ-like pose where he sees himself as sacrificing his life for the good of Bassanio. It's pretty serious stuff. He also, as we started talking about last time, represents a very serious view of masculine friendship. Now again, whether it shades into something homoerotic is another question. I'm actually disposed to accept that interpretation of the play. Someone was talking to me after class in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. There's another character named Antonio, who is also deeply devoted to a young man, Sebastian, and has to go through the same process of losing him to a woman. And this is what Leslie Fiedler pointed out to try to show this is a recurrent plot motif in Shakespeare. But even without going there, there's an intensity of emotion between Antonio and Bassanio, which is quite fundamental to the play. And the word love keeps coming up with regard to them. And I read you that moment during the trial scene where right in front of their wives, these young men talk about how friendship is more important, and I'd see my wife in heaven if it would save Antonio. And that just raises this very seriously the issue. Is friendship more important than romantic love, the love between a man and a woman? And again, that's a pretty serious issue. So Shakespeare pushes comedy to its limits here. This play is comic in its structure. It's a comedy that's trying to contain tragedy, and tragedy keeps trying to break out. And it may be that Shakespeare doesn't quite resolve things as fully as a comedy would demand. It makes it all the greater a play as a result. It's actually more complex, I think, than any of Shakespeare's other comedies. But one reason is it's so political, that it's dealing with a real world. Usually Shakespeare's characters in his comedies have to go off into a forest. The forest of Arden and As You Like It, the forest of Athens in Midsummer Night's Dream, and resolve their problems there. And it really is the sense of a kind of refuge, a kind of alternate to the real world where people have serious issues. They straighten their things out in a kind of world that's literally closer to nature, out there in the woods, and then they can come back to the city. That option isn't here. This play has to be resolved in a Venetian courtroom. So Again, I'm using the notion of comedy and the notion of comic structure to get us to understand the play. And again, let me invoke 5-act structure one more time, not to sound too much like an English professor. When I was in high school, they still taught Shakespeare in terms of 5-act structure. I'm sure they don't anymore. Henry V is good evidence that Shakespeare thought in terms of 5-act structure. Those choruses divide the play into 5 acts. And the acts aren't even. Act 4 is particularly long. It's not as if Shakespeare went every 20 pages and said, let's have a chorus. The way he puts those choruses in there strongly suggests he thought of that play in terms of 5 acts. I say this because for most of these plays, the act and scene divisions are the work of editors, or at least they're not clear cut. Sometimes in the folio, first folio, you'll have 2 acts marked and then the text stops marking acts anymore. So it is fair to say, as many people do, that the 5-act structure was imposed later and that Shakespeare didn't have it in mind. But actually, I think Henry V is a good indication that he did. And remember that the problem in 5-act structure is always the 4th act. That is, in 5-act structure, the 3rd act is the turning point, and then things are resolved, the plot's unraveled in the 5th act, and the 4th act is a kind of holding action. In many ways, Shakespeare shows his genius as a dramatist in his infinite ways of solving the 4th act problem. Talked about the quarrel between Cassius and Brutus, Julius Caesar. Think of Henry V, where the Battle of Agincourt is the 4th act. The 5th act is the ultimate resolution because Henry can't establish his claims to France until he marries Catherine. That's the way he solves the problem. But the 4th act is not going to be boring because it's got the Battle of Agincourt in it. In some ways, Shakespeare was so good at solving the 4th act problem that he creates a 5th act problem that the 5th act threatens to become somewhat anticlimactic. But in Henry V, he creates this wonderful comic drama of Henry and Catherine, which supplies dramatic interest to the act and also gives the appropriate comic feel to what's been a pretty tragic story with a lot of betrayals and deaths and so on, and lets us end on a festive note. Now I'm going to show how that operates in Merchant of Venice. Here too, Shakespeare has an acute 4th and 5th act problem. It is, as I've said several times, it's really strange. The 3rd act is not just the turning point in some place, it ought to be the ending point. Portia has solved the problem of the love test, and she not only is now ready to marry Bassanio, in fact, she does. That's normally the way a comedy ends. But Shakespeare brilliantly introduces the new complication that Antonio is about to die, and boy, will that ever ruin Portia's marriage. And so now we get her she's defeated her own father, she now has to defeat Shylock the father and Antonio the father figure in the 5th act. Now it's a bit like Shakespeare's solution in Antony and Cleopatra. 4th act's the death of Antony, 5th act's the death of Cleopatra. Here, 4th act's the defeat of Shylock, 5th act's the defeat of Antonio. When you see it that way, you see how perfectly structured this play is. And the 4th act, again, the courtroom scene is one of the greatest dramatic scenes ever written. It's one of the greatest scenes in Shakespeare, but that makes it one of the greatest scenes ever written. I remind you, this is the earliest play we're reading. You might call it the first unbelievably great, super-duper dramatic scene Shakespeare ever wrote. Again, the Pacino movie is so good in this scene. And you just hang on your seat. The twists and turns in it. Not to mention the way Shakespeare brings in that extra complication tension between the husbands and wives. It's just extraordinary. And then the unbelievable reversal in it is so intense. It's Shakespeare saying, you think the fourth act's gonna be weak? Wait till you see this fourth act. By the way, in Hamlet, fourth act's given to Ophelia, and the whole drama of her madness and her suicide. It's a brilliant solution there to that problem. But anyway, again, if you see the structure, you see here the goal of comedy is to defeat people like Shylock and Antonio, who are too damn serious about the world. And by the way, along with that is defeat Morocco and defeat Aragon. They come across as very comic because they come across as full of themselves and pretentious. And that's the comic view of the aristocrat. It is not simply Shakespeare's view, because you'll see he creates a tragic figure out of Morocco in Othello. Shakespeare is fully capable of taking the pretensions of a man like Morocco seriously. Again, this is why he seems to be able to move back and forth between comedy and tragedy. I said that tragedy is an aristocratic form. I don't quite want to say that comedy is a democratic form, but let me say that comedy takes the view of the common man. It takes the perspective of ordinary life, where what matters is what matters to these Venetians. It's having good things in life, having a wife or a husband, having a family, having happiness as ordinarily or conventionally understood. One way of conceptualizing this to show you that it's not simply a matter of aristocracy or democracy. In some ways, the relation of tragedy to comedy you can see in the relation of the Iliad to the Odyssey. That is, Achilles is the prototypical tragic figure in our literature. The man of ultimate integrity, completely devoted to his revenge. The man who was given the choice, and in some ways this is the tragic choice, that he could be glorious but die young, or if he lived long, it would be ingloriously. That's the famous choice of Achilles. And of course, he chooses to die young as a hero rather than to achieve a long life by fleeing the battle in Troy. Odysseus is the ultimate survivor. Now, he's still heroic, he's brave, he's got lots of thumos, he's courageous and so on. And yet when you think about the Odyssey, it's all about survival. And it's all about getting home to your wife and your kid and your family and your home and surviving and living a long life. Odysseus, again, Homer is as close as we ever get to the comprehensiveness of Shakespeare, if there was a Homer, and if he wrote both works. But the Homeric poems have the same comprehensiveness that Shakespeare plays, because again, in some ways, the Iliad is the prototypical tragedy. It's a little odd to say the Odyssey is the prototypical comedy, but in a sense it is. It shows you a hero who above all is flexible and adaptable, to the point where Achilles would call him pliant. Achilles doesn't like Odysseus in the Iliad. He says he lies, and that's very true. And Odysseus gets where he does because he doesn't act like Achilles. When the Cyclops asks him who he is, he does not say, I am Odysseus, son of Laertes. The way any good Homeric hero would. He says, I'm nobody. So that when Polyphemus complains to Neptune that some Greek blinded him, and Neptune asks, well, who did it? He said, nobody did it. Now there's that flash in Odysseus when he's out to sea where he remembers he has to say his name, because he's still a Greek hero. But still, when you look at that, Odysseus, who's willing to pose as an old beggar to get at the suitors. Achilles would have just come home and tried to kill the suitors, just walked in, says, me, I'm back, let's fight. Odysseus is too smart to do that. And so he's flexible, he adopts a role. One thing about comedy is it often involves masks. You can see that in Merchant of Venice. Masking, it's part of the way comedy functions. Tragedy because of integrity, no masks. Achilles doesn't go around hiding as somebody else. Odysseus does. Anyway, all these things I think can help you conceptualize this difference and see what's going on in Merchant of Venice. So, well, any questions? Okay, let's see what we can do now with Acts 4 and 5 of Merchant of Venice. The whole strategy of Portia here is brilliant, beginning with her opening, almost her opening line, page 77. So this is Act 4, Scene 1, about line 172. Which is the merchant here and which the Jew? It's the guy with the red hat is the Jew in Venice. I mean, there's something so preposterous about this question. You know, is it Al Pacino or Jeremy Irons? Come on now. But of course, it's a claim to impartiality. As if, you know, I don't even know the difference between the merchant and the Jew here, and so I'm not going to be partial to either one of them. And it turns out her whole strategy will be to sucker Shylock into thinking that she is purely impartial, and therefore his champion because of his conviction of his own justice here. Now, she begins with this very famous speech, page 78, so about line 183 in the scene. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as a gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It's a very beautiful speech, often taken out of context. It turns out not to function in the scene at all. It is an offer to Shylock to exercise mercy. He does not. One might ask, by the end of the scene, how merciful is Portia to Shylock? And he'll remind you of what she said in Act 1, Scene 2, where she said, I don't practice what I preach. And you know, it's probably worth reading that again now in this context. So that's back on page 10. Act 1, Scene 2, about line 15. I can easier teach 20 what were good to be done than to be one of the 20 to follow mine own teaching. I think Shakespeare invites us with that earlier comment to apply it to Portia's sermon here. This doesn't seem she exercises much mercy on Shylock here. What she does in this scene, and it's the brilliance of her approach, is to play upon Shylock's literalism and his devotion to the law. This is one way in which he is Jewish in the play. This is one way that Christians conceive the difference between themselves and Jews, that Jews accepted the law literally, the Old Testament law of Moses, and they stuck to the letter of it, and that since the coming of Christ, the literal strictures of the law had been abrogated, and the law could now be interpreted more loosely. It's very interesting how literal Shylock is in Shakespeare's presentation. If you go back to page 34, again, one of these amazing little touches Shakespeare throws in. This is Act 2, Scene 5, about line, so page 34, Act 2, Scene 5, about line 35. But stop my house's ear, I mean my casements. Shylock uses a metaphor there. The windows of his house are like ears. But he gets worried that maybe Jessica doesn't understand a metaphor. He can't leave it at ears. So I mean my casements. And that's the literalism that's going to trap him in this scene. Because, again, Portia has this all planned out and is taking him step by step. She gets him to rely on what's explicit in the contract, what's nominated in the bond. This is on page 80. About line, 252, where Shylock says, I his breast, so says the bond, doth it not, noble judge, nearest the heart. Those are the very words. This is in a way an odd moment if you go back to the original formulation. It does not seem to be nominated in the bond. If you go back to page 19, so Act 1, Scene 3, on line 142, if you repay me not on such a day, in such a place, such sum or sums as are expressed in the condition, let the forfeit be nominated. That's interesting, that word nominated seems to resonate between these two scenes. For an equal pound of your fair flesh, to be cut off and taken in what part of your body pleases me. The language is not nearest his heart. Now, again, Shylock is outlining the bond in the earlier scene, and maybe when it was drawn up, we are to assume it included specifically the words nearest his heart. But it's an odd touch, and it does suggest the problem with bonds, with written legal documents, with contracts, that do they always formulate it properly, and are there different formulations, and are there differences between oral and written contracts? It's very interesting. This is the moment in English law when written contracts were beginning for the first time to prevail over oral contracts, if you can believe it. In an illiterate society, at first written contracts were very suspicious to people. And so a series of cases just around this point, written contracts started to prevail. So I don't know, in any case, there's something going on here with an interrogation of the whole principle of the contract or the written contract. Again, this would go in line with comedy's suspicion of the inflexible. Comedy tends to be anarchic. It tends to be suspicious of the law. The defect of the law is it always tries to spell out everything. And this is a good lesson in how you can't do that. But this is how Portia corners Shylock here when she says, this is line 256, have by some surgeon Shylock on your charge to stop his wounds, lest he do bleed to death. And Shylock says, is it so nominated in the bond? It is not so expressed, but what of that? 'Twere good for you, so much for charity. I cannot find it, 'tis not in the bond. And this is when Shylock is trapped by his literalism. If it's not explicitly written in the bond, it's not legal. And so we then get this sequence I talked about last time with the husbands and the wives. But Portia's now ready to spring a trap. This is page 82, so about line 300. A pound of that same merchant's flesh is thine. The court awards it, and the Lord doth give it. Most rightful judge. Now it's essential that Portia has gotten to this point as Balthasar, that she appears to be on Shylock's side. He is convinced that justice is on her side. If she's on her side, she represents justice. Remember, he calls her a Daniel, page 79, line 222. This is an interesting sequence here. Begins on the bottom of 78, where Bassanio offers more money, and then top of 79, line 213, and I beseech you, rest once the law to your authority, to do a great right, do a little wrong, and curb the school devil as well. Rest once the law. That's the comic spirit. Be flexible. Don't stick by the letter of the law. Now, we know that Portia has wrested the law when it came to her father's will. And indeed, she's going to do it again here. But just as she did with her father's will, she will not appear to wrest the law. This is the problem of Bassanio and the others. they think the Duke can just appear to violate the law. And in commercial Venice, that can't happen. And indeed, that's what Portias says here. There is no power in Venice can alter a decree established. It will be recorded for precedent and made in error by the same example Russians say it cannot be. And that's when Shylock says, a Daniel come to judgment. She's Jewish. She's like that. She's one of my tribe. This is, this is how she's going to blindside him. That she forces him to accept his authority. And so when back to page 82, she's ready to have him execute the sentence, line 3 or 5, tarry a little, there's something else. This bond doth give thee here no jot of blood. It is not nominated in the bond. The words expressed are a pound of flesh. Take then thy bond, take thou thy pound of flesh, but in the cutting of it, if thou dost shed one drop of Christian blood, thy lands and goods are by the laws of Venice confiscate unto the state of Venice. And notice Shylock asks, is that the law? And it's quite remarkable how he accepts her judgment at this point. Indeed, he is trapped by his own literalism. He said the law has to spell it out exactly. If it doesn't say I need a surgeon here, then I don't need a surgeon here. And damn it, he realizes it didn't say I could have any blood. There's a principle in law called res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. I mean, a good lawyer at this point would say, he didn't have to spell out the blood. A pound of flesh includes blood. I mean, the thing speaks for itself. But Shylock doesn't even struggle with this. It shows how much he's going to live or die by the law in this scene. And then he yields, I take this offer then, pay the bond thrice and let the Christian go. Now, this is when Shylock ceases being the proto-tragic figure we've been seeing. In some ways, he's been so concerned with his dignity. He's been standing for justice here, standing for his rights, and now he'll take the money. Remember I said the odd thing about Shylock is for much of the play, he doesn't care enough about money. He's more interested in his dignity and getting his revenge than he is in getting his money. He wises up pretty fast here. And this is, there are many people who say Shylock is a tragic figure, and I can understand that and sympathize with this. But a tragic figure would not yield this fast. And this is Shylock's conversion here. Not so much conversion to Judaism yet, but the conversion to the principle of survival. He sees that he's gone too far, and he's willing to back off in the way a truly tragic hero would not. But Portia's got him really cornered here, and Shylock doesn't even get back any of his money, and suddenly finds himself charged as an alien. Page 83, about line 347. It is enacted in the laws of Venice, if it be proved against an alien that by direct or indirect attempts he seek the life of any citizen. This is what I mean when I say that Venice treats Shylock as a second-class citizen. Is he an alien? He's been living in Venice maybe all his life, living in the ghetto, but living in Venice. And, was I an alien when you borrowed money from me? And you'll see this is very similar with the situation of Othello. I think Shakespeare does expose the hypocrisy of this community of Venice that claims to bring in people from all around the world, but really has prejudices against them. You can certainly see that in Portia, to the extent we want to regard her as emblematic of Venice. And so ultimately Shylock is forced to become a Christian. Notice it's Antonio that raises the issue. It's rather interesting, bottom of page 84, so about line 386, that for this favor he presently become a Christian. It's another sign that perhaps Antonio is the only serious Christian in the play. You might have thought the Duke would invoke it, or maybe even Portia, but no, it's Antonio. And this scene on the page, the moment that follows, is very ambivalent. When Shylock says, this is line 393, I am content, clerk draw deed of gift, I pray you give me leave to go from hence, I am not well. As I like to put it, Christianity makes Shylock sick. Here, Puccino is wonderful in this scene, and it's a real challenge to actors. I've seen it done so many different ways, because Shakespeare leaves the moment ambivalent. I saw Peter O'Toole play Shylock at Stratford in England, and he used every inch of his height. They had to force him down to his knees at this moment, and you could see the resistance in it. On the other hand, I saw George C. Scott play Shylock, and he just went into a groveling mode at this point, as if he really was converting. And I'll just try to spotlight the scene for you by discussing alternatives here. Just looking at this scene in Shakespeare, it may be hard to get a fix on it. I know there are many critics who see this as the triumph of Christian Venice over Shylock and talk about how the audience in Shakespeare's day would have welcomed this moment, and conversion to Christianity was a subject much to be celebrated. But remember, this is a world in which Gobbo worries that this will increase the price of pork in Venice. This is a world in which not everyone is so celebrating the conversion of Jews to Christianity. And it turns out there are a lot of such moments in Elizabethan and Jacobean drama. Conversion scenes were quite common in plays at this time, and they're very different from this. They're usually genuine celebrations. There's a play called A Fair Maid of the West, Part 2, by Thomas Heywood, where a Muslim converts to Christianity. And he says, oh, this is wonderful. I realize now how superior Christianity is to Islam, and please welcome me to the community, and everybody welcomes him to the community. Shakespeare doesn't show any of that. This is the moment where in comedy you would feel more inclusiveness, the sense that Shylock is genuinely converted and should be welcomed fully into the Christian community. Shakespeare doesn't show that. Again, there was the Mediterranean world in Shakespeare's day was incredibly complex, and Christians were expelling Jews and Muslims from their lands, and Christians were enslaving Muslims, and Muslims were enslaving Christians. Everybody was enslaving Jews, and people were converting back and forth. There's a whole genre of conversion play. There's a play called A Christian Turned Turk by George Dayborn. Just listen to that, A Christian Turned Turk. It's about a guy who's captured by Muslim pirates, and to save himself turns Muslim, and Dayburn stages a circumcision scene on stage. One of the funniest scenes in all of Elizabethan drama. He exploits all the comedy of this poor guy having to be circumcised as part of his conversion. Measured against other conversion scenes of this time, Shylock is very tight-lipped. Nothing about how joyous it is to become a Christian. In fact, what he says is, I am not well. Now, the spoiler alert, in the Puccino movie, which really does shade the movie towards Shylock's side, the next to last scene, completely added, is Shylock excluded from the synagogue in Venice. And it's a very poignant moment. I have to say it's a very intense, dramatic touch, but it is the notion that Shylock is now a complete outsider. He's not going to be welcomed into the Christian community in Venice. He's now lost his position in the Jewish community. Now, that really is rewriting Shakespeare to make a point. And I think they were very concerned that the movie not appear to be anti-Semitic. And as I say, that's going too far. But it does show that Shakespeare doesn't go all that far himself in terms of showing Shylock integrated into the Venetian community. This is presented as a punishment in the play, and there's very little attempt to make Shylock feel happy at the end. You know, the way Scrooge is finally happy at the end. That's the point of comedy. That the Scrooges of the world should have a reformation of heart and be able to participate in the festivities at the end. Shylock is completely excluded from the fifth act in this play. That's very unusual in Shakespearean comedy. Even these tragic relief figures I mentioned to make it into the end of the fifth act and then march off. Malvolio is still there in the fifth act of Twelfth Night and storms off, but he's there. It's as if I think Shakespeare understands he can't have Shylock in the fifth act and make it work comically. And it comes down to the fact that Shylock is so bound up with his Judaism. Very often the way Shakespearean comedy resolves itself is conversion in love. Very often you have two men in love with the same woman and one woman scorned, and the solution is to have one of the two men fall in love with a scorned woman, and then Jack will have Jill, as Shakespeare puts it. We can, you have to convert your allegiance from one woman to another woman. That Shakespeare sees as very human, something that happens all the time. Conversion from Judaism and Christianity is something more fundamental than that. And I think Shakespeare doesn't, there's this sense in which this can't be Shylock anymore if he's Christian. I think the movie is trying to suggest that. And, it suggests the whole problematic nature of this play where Shakespeare rests the blocking agent character of Shylock on his religion, something so fundamental and deep that it's hard to have him simply abjure what he was. I think this makes it, in a way, a failure as a comedy, but a greater success as a play. It is a play that probes so deep, it's almost hard to take it as a tragedy. That is then Shakespeare's challenge in the fifth act. The fifth act, which is very short, and in some ways lacking in action. Again, so much has been resolved at this point, but it's particularly interesting to see how Shakespeare opens the fifth act. And it's with an incredible outpouring of lyric poetry that he was very capable of, but I think he's using all his resources to make us forget Shylock. The emotions of the fourth act, the trial scene, however we see it ultimately resolved, are tragic emotions. I mean, there's the threat of death to Antonio, then the threat of death to Shylock. I mean, this is really serious stuff. It's not the kind of stuff you see in Animal House, or typical romantic comedy today. And so I think Shakespeare pulls out all the stops here to change the mood. And so we cut to Lorenzo and Jessica, who are outside this fray, and they're under the moon, and they're talking about tragedy. That's what's so extraordinary about this opening. By the way, the movie omits this whole opening dialogue between them, and what's left of the scene, it transfers to an earlier moment. The movie does not understand what Shakespeare was doing here. Or for that matter, the movie doesn't want to minimize our tragic feelings about Shylock, and so maybe they did know what they were doing. But I want you to see what Shakespeare's doing. We're hearing about Troilus and Cressida, Pyramus and Thisbe, Dido and Aeneas, Medea and Jason, all these great tragic figures from antiquity. And what they all have in common is they came from divided worlds. Troilus the Greek and Cressida the Trojan, Pyramus and Thisbe, the model for Romeo and Juliet, come from rival families. Dido the Carthaginian, Aeneas the Roman, Medea the barbarous Scythian or whatever she was, the Colchian, and Jason the Greek. And remember, this is Lorenzo and Jessica, the Christian and the Jew. Here, they are from rival religions, but their story is not ending tragically. There's a kind of post-tragic feel to the scene, that tragedy has passed into the realm of lyric poetry, into the realm of myth here, and this is the hope that this couple could achieve something. Although this is a strange note on page 90, discordant note, line 17, where she says, "In such a night did young Lorenzo swear he loved her well, stealing her soul with many vows of faith, and they are a true one." I don't quite know what to make of that line. Why is Jessica having these doubts about Lorenzo? Although she would have reason to wonder whether he loved her because of all those ducats that she stole from her father. But again, it's a slightly discordant note then. But as I say, Shakespeare does everything he can here to change the mood, including music. And it's one of those moments, this is on page 91, where Shakespeare calls for music, and then we get this incredibly beautiful speech from Lorenzo, line 54, "How sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank." Ralph Vaughan Williams set this to music, the English composer. It's called Serenade to Music. It's a very gorgeous piece of music, readily available in some excellent performances. And what Lorenzo speaks of here is the music of the spheres. They're looking at the heavens here, the sky, line 58, "Look how the floor of heaven is thick and laid with patterns of bright gold. There's not the slightest orb which thou beholdest, but in his motion, like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubims." This is mostly the passage that Vaughan Williams sets to music. "Such harmony is in immortal souls, but whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close in, we cannot hear it." This is the most Neoplatonic passage in all of Shakespeare. I won't go into the elaborate business of what Neoplatonism was. It's a philosophy of late antiquity, but it's also related to Plato. This is, in a way, one of the most philosophic passages in Shakespeare. It points to the idea that there's a order and a harmony in the universe and intelligibility in the universe that can even take the form of the music of the spheres. And it's used to tame thumos. It's a really interesting line 70. "The reason is your spirits are attentive." There's even the word spirit. "Do but note a wild and wanton herd or race of youthful and unhandled colts, fetching mad bounds, bellowing and neighboring loud, which is the hot condition of their blood. If they but hear, perchance, a trumpet sound, or any air of music touch the ears, you shall perceive them make a mutual stand." Now, as I've said before, horses are one of the great emblems of thumos among the ancient Greeks. The horse is a spirited animal, and it's associated with war. And here's the notion of music being used to calm thumos. Now again, if you know Plato's Republic, that's the absolute center of the educational program Socrates advances there, that these men who are to be the guardians, the men who stand for the principle of thumos in the city, they need to be taught music. Now, for the Greeks, that's a slightly larger word involving anything with the muses. So it involves poetry, but it also means quite specifically music in our sense. And Aristotle's Politics contains a book on music. And these things seem very strange to us. but is part of the Greek understanding of politics, that music could be used to tame the soul, and particularly the soul of spirited men. And that's when you get Lorenzo's reference to the unmusical man here. This whole passage, therefore, line 78, therefore the poet did feign that Orpheus drew trees, stones, and floods, since naught so stockish, hard, and full of rage, but music for the time to change nature. The man that hath no music in himself, nor is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. Now remember, Shylock had no music in his soul. He didn't want to hear music. Really shut my windows so we don't hear music. And so there's a sense here that what we need to do is calm the passions, and especially the thumatic passion, revenge, that just almost brought Venice to an impasse here. Now, what I'm saying, this passage enacts what it talks about. It's trying to calm us now. Again, I'm in tatters after watching that fourth act. Especially when you see someone as great as Puccino do the role, just drained after that scene. And this is part of calming us down to accept a comic ending. And so all that's left now is to resolve the problem of the rings. In a way, a very minor problem. Turns out to be easily resolved, but still a problem. That Bassanio and Gratiano have come back after giving away the rings that they swore they would always keep to their wives. And we know the wives know about it because they're the ones they were given to. And so the resolution here, beginning on page 95, so much humor here because we know what the situation is and the men don't. But see the problem, line 134, as Bassanio introduces his friend. This is the man, this is Antonio, to whom I am so infinitely bound. And I will remind you that is not what Portia wishes to hear. You don't want to have your husband tell you that there's a man to whom he's infinitely bound, which suggests not only that you're sharing love with this man, but your husband's love for this man is greater than his love for you. It's indeed infinite. And indeed, we saw the measure of the infinity of love here. Same thing we've seen with Antony and Cleopatra and Romeo and Juliet. The infinity of love is the willingness to die for that person. And Portia says, you should be in all sense be much bound to him, as I hear is much bound for you, no more than I'm well acquitted of. And then Portia says, sir, you are very welcome to our house. It must appear in other ways than words. Therefore I scant this breathing courtesy. Now I think this is a pretty cold welcome. I've never seen anyone choose to present it as such in a production. But I like to look at what's omitted in a play as well as there. And Shakespeare is capable of writing effusive greetings. He's capable of finding words for people to express their warm feelings. And this is as cold as it gets, short of, I don't want you in my house, you husband stealer. Sir, you are very welcome to our house. It must appear in other ways than words. Therefore I scant this breathing courtesy. It is not courtesy to scant courtesy. This is the absolute minimum welcome under the circumstances. And again, if an actress wanted to show this, it could be easily done. The actress in the Puccino movie actually, I think, is fighting against the words in this scene. And then the quarrel breaks out between Gratiano and Nerissa, and ultimately between Portia and Bassanio here in all this argument about the rings, and legitimate argument it is from the wife's point of view. It's all a question of to accept anything in place of them. And then turn to page 98, line 237, when Antonio says, I am the unhappy subject of these quarrels. And I want you to notice it's taken him almost 100 lines to speak up here. On 95, at line 138, he says, no more than I am well acquitted of. And he does not speak again until line 238, I am the happy subject of these quarrels. Again, I've never seen an actor exploit this situation, or a production exploit this situation. But I would have poor Antonio standing there, getting increasingly puzzled at what's happening, and maybe even have him gesture to saying something and not being able to get a word in edgewise. But you have to picture him here cooling his heels as he realizes what the problem is, that I am the unhappy subject of these quarrels. And that's almost admission that my heavy appraisal I had of friendship is causing the problem to these marriages. And Portia says, Sir, grieve not you, you are welcome notwithstanding. Again, I can't see why no director has understood these lines. I don't know, maybe someone here has seen a production where people acknowledge this, but that again, you are welcome notwithstanding. You know, it's like, grieve not you, the troubles between me and my husband, I'm going to show him up. And then Antonio surrenders. Line 249, I once did lend my body for his wealth, which but for him that had your husband's ring, had quite miscarried. I dare be bound again, my soul upon the forfeit, that your Lord will never break more break faith advisedly. Then you shall be assured, give him this, and bid him keep it better than the other. Here, Lord Bassanio, swear to keep this ring. And there, Antonio marries Portia and Bassanio. That's what he does here. It's the genius of the scene that and Portia knows that this marriage has been incomplete as long as Bassanio's loyalty to Antonio remained. And in effect, Antonio is forced here. He had rather died than see this moment. I mean, he wanted to die a martyr to his friendship. Send Bassanio off to a marriage in which he would always remember that his friend Antonio loved him more than his wife Portia ever did. And indeed, I'm going to tell you, Antonio, I believe, is willing to die for Bassanio. And I do not believe that Portia would die for her. She's a wonderful woman, and she's solving everything in this play. But I don't think she's stupid enough to die for a guy like Bassanio. If you know Rosalind and As You Like It, she says the same thing to Orlando. You know, I love you, but I'm not going to die for you. Give me a break. But this is an what an amazing triumph she has here. She it's the triple play. It's the hat trick. Defeated her father, defeated Shylock. Now she defeats Antonio, and in a way, Antonio's defeat is the greatest because she gets him to seal the marriage. By the way, I told you the Jacob and Esau story is in the back of this whole play. The Jacob and Esau story is stealing the father's blessing. And again, a triple play. She stole, her father ended up blessing a marriage that Portia, in effect, engineered for herself. She has stolen Shylock's blessing. His wealth is going to go to Lorenzo and Jessica to the state. She's stolen, and now she gets Antonio to bless her marriage. It's really, it's absolutely. This is why I call this Shakespeare's Seinfeldian play, because all these plot lines just come together brilliantly at the end here. And then she buys off Antonio. Miraculously, she somehow heard that his ships have come in. Line 275. There you shall find 3 of your argosies originally come to harbor suddenly. You shall not know by what strange accident I chanced on this letter. Probably because she wrote it. Again, these things happen in comedy. Your wealth shows up again unexpected, but it is Antonio's reaction. I am dumb. And this is the way, maybe we know her inexhaustible supply of wealth. Maybe she's going to buy him off here. And indeed, the play then ends with the 3 married couples going off to bed, Portia and Bassanio, Gratiano and Nerissa, and Lorenzo and Jessica. One last twist, by the way, line 293, Lorenzo said, fair ladies, you drop manna in the way of starved people. Given the way Jews end up in this play, that seems insult to injury there to bring up the issue of manna at this last moment. But notice the isolation of Antonio here. And this is something that the film emphasizes, and most modern productions emphasize this. And it is a slightly discordant note in a comic ending. Shakespeare usually manages it so that every person gets a spouse at the end of the play. There's anybody left unmarried, they find someone from that. Therefore, these multiple marriages at the ends of plays like Measure for Measure or As You Like It, it would have been easy enough for Shakespeare to get Antonio a spouse here. Certainly, Gratiano gets one very easily. You found the mistress, I found the maid. That's as much as it took there. Believe me, Shakespeare was clever enough to have had some woman floating around in the play who could now marry Antonio. It actually, again, supports the Fiedler thesis of Antonio's homosexuality, that would not be a happy ending for him. But it does make the ending not all-inclusive. Again, a Shakespearean comedy tries to create almost a dance at the end where everyone participates in it. But Antonio is left in the cold here. And again, it is up to the director, and it really, I've noticed it as a predominant trend in recent productions going back 20 years. You could even some directors, have a spotlight on the lone Antonio there, gazing, melancholy. Because again, the 3 couples are going off to the consummation of their marriages, and Antonio's got his ships back or wealth back, but he's lost the one love of his life. And that's the sense in which, both Shylock and Antonio get defeated in this play by both, specifically by Portia, but the whole comic spirit that she represents. So, well, before I sum up, any questions? Again, there's such a complicated. By the way, I'm going to come to the 2 sections this afternoon because I went to the one on Tuesday and I had a lot of fun. And this play is so complex. I don't claim. I really, to this day, don't claim to understand it. I keep finding new things to puzzle me about it. But let me try to sum it up with a completely inconclusive conclusion. That is, Shakespeare is exploring another political possibility here, of which he got a glimpse in his day through Venice, the shining example of a commercial republic. And I don't know if Shakespeare fully understood its importance, but in retrospect, it sure as hell looks important to us, and makes this play very important because it comes as close, I think, as we get to Shakespeare looking at our world. That is, he's looking at a world that tries to solve the human problem by commerce. It is a commercial city. tries to bring people together for the sake of commerce. All this trade, people from all around the world. It reminds us that we like things from all around the world. You know, it takes a village, but not to get coffee and spices. You know, if you just live in a village, you're not going to get all these good things of life, like bananas in winter. Venice is this modern principle that we'll trade with all the world, we'll bring all the things we want to our city, and we'll have all these different people in the city trading. And how can we bring them together when they don't eat with each other, drink with each other, or pray with each other? And the answer is we'll do it by having them buy and sell with each other. And then we'll try to found a community on commerce as a central activity, and on a law that will be neutral, impartial, that will not be able to see the difference between which is the merchant and which is the Jew. And Shakespeare, you know, sees that as a very intriguing possibility. And in particular, that Venice seems to neutralize the two most disruptive forces in political life, aristocracy and religion. And you can see it, we saw in Henry V, it's actually more evident in other of the history plays. You can certainly see it in the Roman plays, the sense that the aristocratic warrior spirit of nobles, thumos, is a very disruptive force in political life. It makes people fight to the death over honor. At the same time, we got hints of this in Henry V, that Christianity, any trans-political religion, a religion that is not bound by the rules and the horizons of a particular community, is like a fifth column in the city. It's like a counterforce in the city. And we saw that with the bishops and the archbishops in Henry V. Henry has to tame them and get them in line. And in Shakespeare's day, religion had emerged as the most disruptive force in European politics. It had produced the Crusades, a colossally futile gesture, as it turned out, an effort of Western Europe to conquer and then to reconquer the Holy Land. The division between Protestants and Catholics had begun in Shakespeare's memory. You know, in England with Henry VIII, you started to have the wars between Catholic and Protestant states. England had been threatened with the Armada in 1588. The 17th century was going to be much worse. The 30 Years' War in Germany between Protestants and Catholics destroyed between 1/2 and 2/3 of the whole population of Central Europe. Shakespeare is seeing religion as a powerful and dangerous force. And so here's Venice, basically says, don't get jacked out of shape by your aristocratic pretensions. Don't get jacked out of shape by your religious beliefs. The aim is to keep the price of pork low, and then we can all eat it. And this in many ways emerged as the solution of the modern philosophers. It begins with Machiavelli. You see it in Francis Bacon. You see it above all in the sequence of Hobbes, Locke, and Montesquieu, to refound the political community on something low, something we could all agree on. And I'll just quickly say that I don't know what Shakespeare's reaction to this. On the one hand, he seems to doubt whether it will even work, whether, say, religious prejudices can ever be really neutralized. Because in the case of Shylock, it turns out Venice hates him anyway and never fully admits him into citizenship. But I actually think for Shakespeare, he's more afraid that it will work. Not so much that it won't, that it might work. Because then the question is, do we lose sight of all these high things that politics used to be founded on, things that led people to fight to the death and that were very dangerous, like religion? But do we want a world in which people are more concerned about the price of pork than they are about the salvation of their souls. I don't know what Shakespeare's reaction to this was, but I offer it to you as an opening up of the play and seeing the kind of issues it raises, and they're very much issues about the modern world we live in. Okay, I hope by next time to have my voice fully back, but we'll have amplification if need be. But on to Hamlet next time.